Hello, and welcome to the Brighter Thinking Pod from Cambridge University Press. My name is Adam, and I'm one of the producers on the pod. Before we get started with today's topic, I want you to imagine the time you'd save if you had classroom assessments that mark themselves. Assessments that adapt to every student's abilities and aptitudes. I'm talking about testing that's suitable for all ages with the power to reveal individual strengths and struggles. This technology frees you to teach, gives you more insight than ever before, and allows you to set motivational goals for each of your students. Sound good? Okay, stop imagining. What I've just described are baseline assessments from the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring. If you're interested in learning more, go to cem.org. That's CEM.org. Okay, let's get on with the pod.
Okay, hello and welcome to the Brighter Thinking Pod from Cambridge University Press, a podcast that brings you advice and conversation from authors, teachers and academics. We're back for part 2 of how to write a good essay. If you haven't already listened to part 1, firstly, where have you been? And secondly, you might want to go back and listen to that one first, before you give this one a listen. I'm your host today, my name's Adam, and I'm a brand marketer at the Press. I look after this podcast and our blog, which is called the Brighter Thinking Blog. Today we're joined by 3 guests who are going to be coming at essays from different perspectives. Our goal is to find out whether there are similarities between subjects in terms of what a good essay looks like. Returning from part 1 is Adrian Ravenscroft. Aid is a global perspectives author and assessment specialist who also tutors full-time education staff looking to gain qualified teacher status. Welcome back, Aid.
Good to be back.
Good. We're also joined by Dr Clair Rawlingson. Claire is an assessment professional and has worked as an A-level examiner, team leader and principal examiner, as well as a Cambridge International teacher trainer. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you, I'm really pleased to be here.
Pleased to have you. And last but not least, we have Liz Keeble. Liz is the Chief Operating Officer of the Karalius Foundation, which delivers inclusive curriculum designed specifically to target disengaged pupils. Hi, Liz.
Hello, nice to be here.
Nice to have you. Remember, all the links and info that we discuss in this pod are available in the show notes. And if you want to get your voice heard on a future show, you can get in touch on Twitter. That's at CUP Education using the hashtag BrighterPod. Finally, please remember to like, review and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. That'll really, really help us out. Okay, so before we dive into today's topic, we have a little icebreaker so that listeners can get to know you a bit better. So what I'd like to know is, who was your favourite teacher when you were in school and why? And I think we'll start with, let's go with Liz first.
So my favourite teacher would have to be Sister Frances. She was the head at my primary school. She was about 4'2", a complete dynamo, but completely understood children. The curriculum that we had was really well structured. We had a wealth of experience, lots of opportunities to get out and about. You know, she let us have snowball fights and took us to the Pyrenees on a school trip. And she understood that if we worked hard, we also needed to play hard. But the standards at the school were absolutely outstanding. And she was just a really encouraging, very supportive, also very strict person. But I have aspired to be like her throughout my career and hope that I have in some way achieved some of the things that she did.
Oh, that's great. So you had a mentor at a very early age then?
Certainly did, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for telling us about that. Claire, favourite teacher?
So my favourite teacher was at the other end of the spectrum at university, which was, funnily enough, where I learnt to write an essay for the first time, really, I think, was at university. And it was a lecturer called John, and in a seminar group, one seminar group when we first started, he said, "I will learn as much from you as you will learn from me." And that really stuck with me. I felt like I was valued and that I had a voice. And what he modelled was, I think, lifelong learning, being a lifelong learner. And it stuck with me. And I find that when I do training, when I've done training, similarly, I learn things. You know, I learn as much when I do the training, as when, as any other time, as if I'm on as if I'm a participant. And I think that's probably why I'm here today, actually, to hear other people's views and keep learning.
That's great. I've never really thought of teachers or lecturers as getting a lot back from students as well, but I suppose it's natural, isn't it? Like any sort of colleague in the workplace.
I think in seminar groups it is, where you all get to have a discussion. There's always another perspective to listen to.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And Aid, you cheated last time and didn't name a teacher, but have you got somebody else for us this time?
Yeah, I'm going to cheat again, perhaps even more than Claire did. I'm going to give a big shout out to Alan Clayton, who was my lecturer in applied education at Sheffield Polytechnic, where I did my postgraduate certificate in education. Clayton was South Yorkshire's answer to Paulo Freire. He was absolutely a passionate advocate of community education. And he was there for us to the extent that I borrowed the money for the train fare so I could get to the interview where I got my first teaching job from Clayton. So, yeah, big shout out for Alan Clayton.
Oh, wow. You've saved it for today to say thank you. This is a good platform, I guess, to do that. Great. Thank you very much. Would everyone like to talk through their specialism then? So, Liz, you're coming at this from a primary perspective, yes?
I am. I've spent 25 years in primary education, and writing an essay was a big priority for me because, like Claire, I hadn't actually learned to write an essay till I got to university. And I thought actually children need to learn these skills a lot younger.
Yeah.
And I spent about 10 years teaching year 6. So the children at the top end of primary who are then going into secondary and hopefully using the skills that they've acquired.
Yeah, thank you. And Claire, how are you coming at this? It's an assessment point of view. Am I correct?
So really from the other end of the spectrum, from having taught academic essay writing skills for university students, or from actually being an examiner and marking research essays for Global Perspectives, and also training teachers within on the Global Perspectives course in terms of how to get their students to write the kind of essays that us as examiners wanted to see. So that's the other end, not primary, university or A levels.
Perfect. And Aid, you're coming at this from...
So interestingly enough, I started off bang in the middle. I worked in the old Northern 9 to 13 middle school system in Bradford. And I went younger into primary. This is after they abolished the 9 to 13 middle school system in Bradford. I went younger into primary and then subsequently went older into secondary. And at around about the same time as Liz, I was involved in teaching what's now top end primary, and became aware of the really good practice that exists in good primary schools that I think secondary colleagues can benefit from in terms of the approach to unpicking what makes an essay, and also the opportunities that there are across the primary curriculum to write essays about different subjects in a similar way. And I think it's that cross-play of applying the skills that you learn in one context to another that enriches learning. And I think I'm hoping very much that we can sort of develop that theme for the benefit of secondary colleagues in this episode.
Perfect. It sounds like we're going to get a good mix of responses. So I'm looking forward to diving into the questions, which I will do now. So first question. So as a teacher, how do I teach what is important to do at the outset of a good essay? I don't know if anybody would like to volunteer to go first on that question before I choose someone like a school teacher to pick on.
I'll go first.
Okay.
I'll go first. So two things come to mind, but one I want to focus on really in terms of what underpins a good essay, and I think it's research. There's no essay without research. There's no essay without research. There's not a good essay without good research. And I think it's something that we underestimate today in terms of we tend to think that because there's so much information at the fingertips of students and pupils with the internet, that research is easy. And I think it's never been more difficult because there is so much information and it can be so overwhelming. There's no cut-off. I know when I was at university, the library shut at 8 o'clock in the evening and I could only get, a number of books. And what I went home with, there was that automatic cut-off, that kind of, your well-being was sorted out because you couldn't get anything else. There was no more information, And I think that helped with creative thinking and with independence of thought. You had to work with what you had, and you became a creative thinker and you became an independent thinker, I think. Whereas now, to navigate all of the information that is at the fingertips, I think as teachers what we need to do is give students methods to navigate that information, and to be able to look at what they're researching and work out what's worthwhile, what's not, and what they want to, and also how they record their click. You click from one thing to another, how you record it, what you record. All those types of things I think are really important. I would say the first thing we need to teach is how to research, and that's where I'd come from.
That's really interesting. I think the idea of actually restrictions place more I suppose restrictions help you be creative in a way, and it's the sheer amount of information that's just at everybody's fingertips now that it's really difficult to distill that into what makes good and focused research. So yeah, really interesting.
Yeah. And how to keep track of that research as well. There's lots of online tools on how to keep track of it, but understanding how to keep track of it and what to keep track of, author, title, publication date, but you've got all of those things that may just disappear on the internet. Keep a screenshot of what you did, of what you've looked at, because actually, and when you accessed it, because when you come to look at it again, it'll be gone. Those things are really painful when you're researching and then trying to write an essay.
Yeah. No, I can appreciate that. Anybody else at the outcomes of an essay? What are you focusing on, whether that's research or something else? Should we go to Liz?
I think, structure is important. Yeah, I think it's about the structure of the essay. And we'll probably talk a lot about that throughout this podcast. But I think listeners, really, teachers that have not taught this before, I think the fundamental thing they need to remember before they even start is that not all the students are going to pick it up straight away. And that they will need to keep coming back to those fundamental principles. It doesn't matter what age anyone is, they need to come at that several times and hear that information several times. It's kind of like a helix. You get broad, you might pick up broad brush strokes the first time round that process. The second time round, you'll pick up a little bit more. The third time round, you will pick up more. And in terms of securing that structure, that's really important. It's important that teachers understand that that information is not going to be taken on board and processed immediately by those students, that they're going to need several different shots at just getting their head around what they need to do, because it's massive. Writing an essay is huge, and when you're looking at the research that you've done to then organise that into the structure, that's really, really difficult, and it's going to take students a fair few attempts to get their head around that, and it might be just working on an element of that with them, an element at a time, until they're able to secure the whole thing. So I think that's, for anybody listening, I think that's really important to remember, that they are not failing as a teacher if their students don't get that the first time round.
No, and I assume that's like anything, it just comes with practice. The more practice you can give students, you're not so sure, Aid.
I would really emphasise that point that Liz made about, look, this is not a one-shot deal. I think, the question was how do we teach a good intro? I think maybe it's worth considering when we come to write it. It's not necessarily that there where we might start, although it's coming first. We might actually look at planning and writing some body paragraphs before we do an intro, because our intro is going to signal what's to come. But I mean, I'd say about how do you teach a good intro? There's elements that are common to that. To how do you teach any section of it? Let's look at some. Let's actually look at quite a lot of them on different subjects. And I think, there's a place here for some discovery learning. Let's have a look at some intros on completely different subjects. Well, what common elements are we noticing about these? Well, let's throw it open to the students. What do you notice about grammatically, structurally? How's this text, this section of text? What strikes you about it? What elements are there? You tell me what you spotted, and then I'll tell you what I'm seeing in this one here. Here's another one that's like it. You tell me what you now I've told you what I've seen in that. What can you see that's like that in this one? Then when we're in a position we're understanding elements of how this text is put together, let's have a look at some ones that are of varying quality. Here's a good one. Here's a medium one. Here's a not so good one. Don't tell them which is which first. You tell me, which one's the better out of these three that I've shown you? What's leaping at you? Why is that one better than that one? And then we can start to sort of try and create some success criteria for ourselves. Right, this is what I need to do when I'm doing my writing.
So just building on what Adrian said, I think writing the introduction to an essay actually is the hardest part. And for anybody staring at a blank piece of paper and thinking, how am I going to get this going? I think Adrian referenced it's not necessarily the best place to actually start the physical writing of your essay. But when you come to teach that, before students even embark on writing one themselves, I would go through all those things that Adrian has said and then look at how could we improve the ones, what can we take from the ones that are good and magpie, that's the language that we would use, how can we magpie that and transfer that into the one that needs improving.
What do you mean by magpie?
So magpieing is a word that we use at primary because magpies thieve. They see the shiny things and enjoy, looking at that. So they go and thieve that and take it. And that's what we encourage very young children to do.
I like
to
that
magpie to magpie that from their own reading when they're doing, when they're reading around, when they're comparing different models. To just steal bits that they like, steal phrases, steal words, even emulate a tone, even to adopt a particular style, to look at what they enjoy and then to transplant that. So when you're doing a very in-depth comparison of what's good and what's not, to start by teaching them how to take what's good and put that into something that's not so good is a really good starting point, especially for students that are going to struggle. They're not all going to get on board straight away. So it's a very good scaffold to get, from one place to another.
Okay, so by magpieing, I think you're talking about taking certain words or phrases that'd be useful to a student's essay or the tone, as you say, and it's definitely not about plagiarizing whole paragraphs. No, okay. Wanted to clarify that.
So, I mean, examples of that, you might sort of phrases that are generically useful, like "on the contrary," or "although something can sometimes be something," or "however, critics point out that." So it's something that pupils do actually get very good at, is just identifying these words and phrases. So actually, I might be writing an essay about why we should or shouldn't have school uniform, and I've got another text in front of me about why mobile phones should or shouldn't be allowed in school. Well, get your highlighter out and identify from this text about mobile phones something that you could use in a text about school uniform, and primary school pupils get very, very good at doing that indeed. And I'd go so far to say you can have some enjoyable lessons doing a bit of magpieing.
I do love that as a phrase. Claire, you look like you're ready to jump in. Was there?
No, I was just going to say that I agreed with what Liz and Adrian were saying, and one of the things that I think just came out was that sometimes the introduction can be hard to write, and sometimes it's not the thing that you might write first. If in the exam room, it's a bit different. So, and I was thinking about if you're in the exam situation about bullet pointing and planning and things, but actually it might be something that you write once you've written your essay. So you sometimes putting pen to paper is the most difficult thing. So just write a few lines out of what you think your introduction is. What am I going to do? There's that very simple structure. Say what you're going to do it, and then say how you did it.
Yeah.
So you can basically say, this is what I'm going to do. Now, get to the end of your essay, what did I do? Then you can maybe rewrite your introduction. I would say go back and edit and rewrite your introduction. Adrian looks like maybe he wants to come in.
I'm again and again we keep coming through this. Okay, if it comes down to an exam situation, there's time consideration. Still, it's worth getting those bullet points in. I mean, Brad last time was very, very, very keen on spending those few minutes with those bullet points. Does produce rewards. I think back in the classroom, learning this skill, you can go through this a number of ways, and taking this a text apart and reducing it to a number of bullet points can be. So you start with an existing text. Well, how could you summarize that in a series of bullet points? One approach to that I've used is just getting a photocopy of a text, giving black felt tip pens out. Okay, let's steadily, let's lose some words. What can you remove, and this text still makes sense? Model that as well. Show them how it's done. Okay, this is how I can get this paragraph here down to a couple of really pithy bullet points that's going to convey that meaning. You see how I did that? Right, you go and have a go with the next paragraph. I can check out. So once they've reduced a text to bullet points from a complete text, then you start to understand how you could do that in the opposite direction.
Yeah. What I'm hearing is a lot of modelling and showing of best practice, especially, I guess, for primary students, because this is where they're learning their essay skills. And it's the finding the good examples as they progressed, and as then Claire was talking about at university, the modelling of best practice throughout primary and then through secondary school will then undoubtedly help when you're coming to university to find, when you're suddenly inundated with the amount of sources you can pick from to quote and the amount of arguments that you can pick. So it is magpieing from an early age to pick out good technique, but also what makes a good source, and or what makes a good question if you have to write your own question? So moving on from what to do at the start of an essay, have you got any tips for what to do after that? Let's go to Aid first.
In the initial stages, it's going to be about scaffolding that process. I think as time goes on, that process is going to become internalized by your students. It's got different students are going to be able to take it on board quicker than others. So I think that's where your adapting of your practice for learners with different prior attainment comes in. If they're taking to it easily, fine, let them go. Let them get to independently apply those skills sooner. Some, you're going to have to scaffold and work with them some more. But they'll get there.
And I don't think exemplars are not needed at university. How you learn to write a good essay is by reading a good essay and reading and reading and reading. You've got to be exposed to good practice at every level. You don't get the structure at the beginning, and you've got to continue that through. There's got to keep being good examples of good practice. That's my understanding.
I agree with that. Every postgraduate qualification that I've got has always begun with the tutor sharing examples of good essays from previous cohorts. And actually, that's always been really invaluable, because invariably, when we're going to talk about this, every discipline has a slightly different way of wording things or a slightly different approach, but actually the structure is the same. So what you're doing is just absorbing, okay, how have I got to do this for maths, or how have I got to do this for special need, but the actual principles of it are the same. You're just then, once you've got those magpieing skills, you magpie from everybody else's essays to make it fit the discipline that you're working in that particular field.
And at a higher level, you don't think of yourself as magpieing, you think of yourself as emulating somebody else.
It's still magpieing.
It's still magpieing. But I think that's the key thing, isn't it? We can take all of these things from primary and move them through, and you're doing the same thing. You just might not call it that.
No.
They do work well as a team sometimes, our magpies. And I think that applies to this process. I mean, Claire, you were saying about your great lecture, saying, look, I'm going to learn as much from you as you are from me in that seminar group. And I think that about what equally is applying is, as students, you are learning from each other as well. So let's not just assume that our students are just going to, as individuals, approach this text and gain meaning or struggle for themselves, but actually getting around, looking together, emulating it. What are we going to take from this? Doing it collectively is something that can be applied right the way through the process.
Yeah. And that's where discussion is so important. Because as a teacher, providing an opportunity for your students to discuss that and to clarify their thinking, again, even before they start the physical writing of the essay, you've got a forum where they can thrash out those points, they can discuss those things. So collaboration at that point is really important before you even put pen to paper, I think.
Yeah, and I think we're looking over the whole of the essay, not just in the introduction. If you're in the classroom, something like mind mapping on a whiteboard, and letting that discussion flow and putting those up on the whiteboard as you go round. I prefer mind map to a spidergram, because mind maps can be so much more organic, and you can colours less detail. but you get that flow. We were talking about flow, and you'll get that flow through your essay by putting it on a mind map, and you can do that collectively, because, you know, there's nothing worse than being sat as a student in front of a blank page. Let's do it all together in the classroom.
I wonder if we might talk a little bit about some of the things that we touched on in preliminary discussion, Liz and Claire, which for me, I think was really important. We were talking about the why bother putting essays together in the first place. And I think that with some justification, you picked up on that the answer to that question in episode 1 perhaps focused a little bit on, of course, it will help us get good marks. And okay, you know, that's one reason for doing it. Yeah, you know, if you get good at putting the essays together, you know, there's a lot of high stakes assessment riding on it. But I mean, I wonder if we could talk a bit about why this skill matters, just in terms of, you know, if we're teaching young people to make sense of the world, which surely is what they're in education for in the first place, then actually, you know, this skill of putting an essay together actually helps you do that.
Absolutely. And it's all about critical thinking. It's about being able to evaluate people's opinions, isn't it, really? You know, it's being able to listen, to reflect, to process, evaluate what you've heard, and then maybe reinforce your own opinion of something or change it. You know, I think it's a key skill. You know, we may not write essays as adults once we've learnt that skill. I don't think we do we really? We don't write an essay for the sheer hell of it. We do it with a view to passing the exams, but we use the skills that we have learnt all the time. You know, when you're reading newspapers, when you're listening to the news, you know, it's invaluable, really. And I don't think, like we were saying, Adrian, in those preliminary discussions, we don't emphasise that enough. We don't emphasise the why enough.
And you know, I mean, if we're going to teach it well, we're going to have to engage our students. And I mean, one of the things we touched on in preliminary discussion was, you know, just the role now of internet influencers. So that one might follow and be influenced by a person and take on those perspectives simply because of who is putting that forward, rather than actual critical engagement.
And also understanding what's of value. So you spoke about influencers, and I think we spoke in the pre about fake news and all of this stuff, and back where we started and talking about research on the internet, and understanding what's a valuable source and what's not, and critically engaging with that, and then undertaking that skill to the real world. And I would say sometimes you can kind of reverse engineer it. So I think we spoke about the fact that students find evaluation particularly difficult. It's that they look at it and think, I can't evaluate. What's evaluation? It's a massive, scary word. And actually, they evaluate every single day. You know, I know, for example, that if I ask my children coming up to Christmas, what set of headphones would you like? And they'll be quite easily go out, research the market, come back and say to me, I don't want headphones, I want pods. I don't want, and tell me exactly why I don't want headphones, or why I want a gamer's headset, because it will be good for this. It won't be good for what I need it for. The pros and cons of it, the fact that they'll analyze it by price. They'll, you know, all of those things, and they'll put together a really good argument. Similarly, if I ask them, do we want, you know, what should we go to the cinema to see today? They can quite easily tell me why they want to go and see a certain film, but look at it and say, but this suits everybody, looking at everybody else's perspective. They can do that quite easily and tell me. And I think it's getting it's back in examination speak, but students, pupils, that's my learners, that's my assessment, that's my examiner hat on. But it's getting pupils, learners to understand you do this every day. Now we just need to formalise it and put it into an academic capacity, format, so that you actually do this, and then you go through it, and then you become more critically engaged and contextualize it, and you can take it again back out into the real world. So I don't think it's just about examinations, it's about life skills, and it's about honing life skills that we possibly already have.
Absolutely.
If that makes sense.
So how do you bring those out if they're skills that students are using every day? How do you bring them out and into an essay? Because I know when I was at school, I might have been able to argue with my mum about what I wanted for Christmas, but then put me in an essay and say, well, now you have to have a critical point of view. You need to synthesize different sources. You need to organize your argument. How do you then show them that the life skills they picked up in the real world can then transfer to an essay?
So I think the first thing is to demystify it, which is what we were talking about. And then in terms of teaching and practice, possibly I would defer to Liz and Adrian there in terms of how they would teach that in a classroom. But initially I would go for demystifying it and then doing it as a group, like we were talking about before, doing these things as a group, modelling it in the classroom, maybe giving them a couple of sources that they might look at and getting them to take it apart, or putting an argument in front of some students and saying, right, this half of the classroom's going to take, or this group's going to take that side of the argument, this group's going to take this side of the argument, and then we'll have a third group that's looking at it and saying, right, which was I persuaded by? Those type of things I think work quite well in a classroom. But Liz and Adrian, I'm sure, will be able to speak to that.
But it comes back to that helixical learning again at primary school. I would probably say, write me an essay on why you want those headphones for Christmas, because they're going to have magpied the language, and they will be able to say, I can get iPods from here, but on the other hand, I could go to, Curry's and buy whatever I get from Curry's, because at Curry's they're doing this, and they can interweave that in a context that they understand. And then the context is that helix, it just becomes increasingly more complex as they go through secondary school, as they go through sixth form, as they go through uni. The context becomes more challenging. The sources that they're looking at become more and more challenging, and there are more of them, and they're from different parts of the planet. But what you're doing, that in itself, in a way, is a scaffold, because you're not chucking them in. I'm not going to say to my students at primary school, right, I want you to do me analysis on scene 4 of Macbeth and tell me why, so-and-so says this. It is all about where it's their starting point, isn't it? It's what Adrian said earlier. It's about where that learner's starting point is, and finding a way in to show them, well, actually, you've just done your analysis of the headphones. Now use this structure to write that as an essay. And then as you get older, that context changes, but it's you're still using the same skills.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important that it starts at primary and moves through, and that you build, because it's something that I think we do quite well now, but definitely I didn't necessarily learn to do that until quite late on. And I think it's something that sometimes is taught at primary, drops off a bit at secondary. We don't look at skills so much, we look more at content and syllabus, and then you're supposed to come back to it again at university. And so it's how you build on those all the way through, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and I think we said this in our preliminary discussions as well. And I know, Adrian, we want to focus on that cross-curricular, multidisciplinary approach to it. I think at primary, you're really well placed to get kids to write in a variety of different contexts across the curriculum. So they might learn that essay writing skill in a literacy lesson, but then they can apply it in history, because you've got the same teacher doing those same things. Whereas at secondary, you've got different teachers teaching different subjects. So the teacher that's teaching you English and teaching you how to write an essay in English may have a completely different approach to your history teacher. And that's where it becomes confusing. I think what we need at secondary almost is more dialogue between departments, and to see how topics could be put together. So you've got one person teaching the skill, but everybody else then providing opportunities to apply it, really.
A joined up thinking, I think, across departments, because then when you get to university, you are back into interdisciplinary, where you're looking at your English essay and saying, right, I'll approach this from a historical perspective, or from a political perspective, or from psychoanalytic point of view. So actually, you need those structures, need that joined up thinking in terms of the way you research, and it gives teachers then more time in the classroom to focus on some of the content, because they're trying to deliver the content and you're trying to deliver the skills at the same time. How much easier if that is spread out across many different lessons?
And just try and come to some sort of agreement of it. I mean, and it really does come as second nature to effective primary school teachers. You'll see it done. I mean, and having got hold and really internalized that process of putting a good essay together. We're focusing on essays, but it could be whatever text type. It really is empowering for children. And they can, because they feel secure in that structure, they then can approach really some really complex subjects, with confidence. So, if I really have got my head around, constructing this debate, should we have school uniform? Yes or no? Is that a good idea? We've magpied all the phrases. We know how this structure works. You can then throw in some really complicated things. Okay, you imagine you're an ancient Greek city state, and you're going to make a choice. Should we be governed like Athens or like Sparta? Put together a discussion on those lines. That is something that 11-year-olds and younger can do.
Absolutely. And I think even it's just occurred to me that really it's also, essay writing, putting together a structured essay is also the basis of writing a letter. If you want to write a letter to your MP arguing a particular point, you're going to use that same structure. You're going to have your introduction. You're proposing building 3,000 homes on our roundabout, but have you thought about blah, 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 blah? Please, your conclusion is we don't want this. Please take time to consider it. It's the same principle. So that again, the skills that you're teaching students when they're doing that will enable them. It's about expression, isn't it? You're enabling them to express themselves, to give a point of view in a coherent way that isn't just influenced by whoever they may have seen on YouTube ranting about the building development that's going to be built on their roundabout. It's giving them a little bit more of a reasoned argument.
What was that thing you were talking about, Liz? About you'd got the assessment for learning technique. You've got kind of 3 columns up on the wall on display. That was interesting.
Yeah, so you've got kind of a chart in the classroom, and let's say you're teaching with assessment for learning. What you're looking at is cross-curricular skills, and that actually you can fulfill success criteria, but you still may not necessarily produce a good piece of writing. It's a lot more than that. So you're looking at not just, it's what we said earlier, not just what the ingredients are, but also how to make it good. So we would have an A4 sheet or a big poster form where you would have your learning objective and then the context in the middle, and then your success criteria at the end. That would also include would be good about that, and they were always generic writing skills. That was never contextually dependent. That was always, what is good in history is going to be good in English, is going to be good in geography, is going to be good in science. And then the only thing that changed in the middle was the context. So if you were learning to write an essay, the context might be, was Henry VIII right to behead Anne Boleyn? But your success criteria are going to be the same, irrespective of what that context was. So what the children learnt from that visual was that actually this is what we're learning. This is how I know how to make it good. And then the context, that bit in the middle, can change. It can be, anything really. And that was very powerful. And what the children then came to do was add to the success criteria themselves. The things that they had done personally that had made that, perhaps a little bit better than Billy next door. They would add that onto their own set of success criteria. So you're constantly, comes back to that helix again. It's just every time you approach it, it's deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper.
And it's important, isn't it, to encourage reflection and the reflective learner. And I think that's important. So what you're talking about there, what in terms of, what did I do? What success criteria helped me? What went well? Even better if, that kind of reflection, and how we encourage that in classrooms. And again, that starts young and it goes all the way through. And I think this feeds into something we wanted to talk about, Adrian, or we talked in terms of, which you talked about in the introduction, in terms of the use of the use of I in, what have I done well in terms of reflection. And I think that's when the use of I comes in. We know very well that where I've worked on global perspectives, and it's about skills, and it's about essay writing skills. Actually, at the end, that use of the first person is important in terms of reflecting on what you've done. What did I set out to do? How did I do it? Did I do it well? What could I have done better? What could I research? What could I look at now? And I think those are important in terms of what you're saying there, Liz, in terms of looking at, success criteria. What worked for me? How do I develop my own learning pathway?
And also, I think it's important. Talking about I thought long and hard about that, because I thought about my own journey through essay writing, and there are certain contexts where it's very important that you reflect on your own journey. It's very important that you can say, actually, I used to think this, but having read this, now I think something completely different, because what that then shows is that you have the capacity to change your mind, that you are open-minded, you haven't got a fixed mindset, that actually, part of listening to an argument and part of participating in an argument, whether that's written or verbal, is about listening to both sides, and actually having the grace sometimes to admit that what you once thought about something, you no longer think, because this person's given you a different perspective on that. I think that's really important. And I think now in 2022, in terms of the equality, inclusion and diversity agenda, that's more important than ever, because I think we are constantly reflecting on what we think, how history has contextualized certain things. That's a constant, every day we're being presented with new ways of thinking about things. So it's important to remember that you have a place there, that how you think and how you feel and your opinions have potentially changed because you have engaged in that argument.
And the courage to say that I have engaged with it. That this is what I've looked at, and this is the conclusion that I've reached. One comes across responses that seem to go along the lines of, well, there are all these strongly held opinions out there. And it's almost like forming a coherent view, even if one acknowledges that, okay, I could be persuaded otherwise, but forming a coherent and strongly held view is the slippery slope to that's how totalitarianism happens, by people having these strongly held views. So I'm going to conclude my argument by not concluding, because that will show I'm not a totalitarian. And that engagement. No, I'm prepared. I might be persuaded otherwise. But based on the evidence that I've got in front of me here, I've listened to counter arguments. This is what I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, being able, I think, talking about the authority of a source is really important, and questioning where it's come from. What is the provenance of this? We see this all the time at the moment with fake news on Facebook or wherever. People will suddenly produce a document and say, oh, this one's saying this, and you think, but where has that come from? What is the source of that? How robust is that source? How biased is that source? Has that source got relevance in this context, in this argument? Because then you're already filtering down your research, Claire, aren't you? To come back to that, you're already eliminating certain things. Am I going to quote the guy from YouTube who said blah, 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 blah? Well, you might, if he's an eminent professor and he's giving a TED talk and he's done whatever and he's got a background in something, but not if it's Joe Bloggs from down the road who just happened to feel X, Y, and Z, and this is what he's doing on his daily blog. So it's really important that you're teaching students that all the time, and questioning, getting them to question, to raise those flags, really.
And that they're engaging with that critically, and they're not just sitting there and saying, right, so thinking about this I think again, this opinion, not just actually having listened to the other side, looked at the other perspectives, listened to them, analysed, put over an objective opinion at the end of the day, and not just taken sources and gone, right, this is what I think. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of these sources. They're not really that good, and using those sources to shoot down their argument to make their own point, because that happens quite a bit. This is what I want to say. Here's all these really robust, good sources that back me up. Here are some other sources, but they're not particularly very good. And you've chosen it. It's like, actually, no, you need to look at both sides of the argument, and you might have robust sources on both sides, and it's looking at it and saying, okay, so now where do I stand? I can see both sides of the argument here. What is it about which argument is the most persuasive, and why is it the most persuasive for me? I have an opinion, but I have a supported opinion.
And that's the bit for me that's exciting as a student. So looking at this from a student's perspective, it's when you've done that research and you think, and then you begin to really unpick those, well, I believe this because that really resonated with me. What that guy said there, absolutely 4,000% is how I feel. And you feel it inside. And then you begin to draw on those arguments. And then I'm getting goosebumps now talking about this, because it's for me, this is the exciting bit. You then look at the sources that he used to come to that conclusion, and then you expand your reading, and then you're online at 4:00 in the morning on Google Scholar looking at all these sources that he's looked at, and your reading just then it just becomes huge. And that's what's exciting, to get a student to that point for me is the that's the gold star.
And what you're pinpointing there is one of the key ways to learn how to research, isn't it? Find a good source. What sources did that person use? Oh, where did they get their information from? And that, and then it goes out and then you can draw it back in.
Go out, find the most authoritative source you can for either side of the argument. And yes, it is down to you to make a judgment between these two highly eminent people who are arguing differently.
I think it's very important especially with a primary source. This is the thing: if you've got eyewitness accounts of certain things that have happened, they're going to have a certain amount of subjectivity to it, because everybody's looking at that event from a completely different perspective. If you read Samuel Pepys's account of the fire of London, it's going to be very, when he's trying to rescue his cheese that's buried underground 6 feet, it's going to be very different from poor old, Sam Jones from down the road who's got nothing and is literally just trying to get his wife and family out of it. Completely different perspectives, but you can't not acknowledge them, can you? You've still got to. They've still got to have. There's a role to play, as long as you are acknowledging the bias, and acknowledging the fact that they may not that is flawed because they're not looking at it from all sides.
And isn't that the best kind of essay writing, when someone actually takes that source on and says, look, I recognise this, however, this still has a support for me. And I think I can hear the excitement in your voice, Liz, and the excitement coming from Adrian in terms of getting to grips with, writing an essay. And I think what I've seen a lot of as an examiner is very formulaic writing, and it might be part of the environment. And these weren't essays that have been written in an examination context. They've been written previously within the classroom and then externally marked. Yeah, but you see a lot of that kind of teaching to test, rather than getting involved in the actual nitty-gritty of writing an essay and the content and getting excited. And then when we're talking about sources, you're seeing it rolled out. We're talking about reputation and those ability to see it, and you see it come out in a formulaic way, and there's nothing in it. There's no heart in it. And I think some of the best essays have heart and passion in them. And one of the things that where students have to maybe write their own essay title, and one of the things you'd sometimes think you want students or learners to steer away from is something that's emotive and something that might lead them not to be objective. However, sometimes those essays are the best kind of essays, and where the student has to show empathy for another perspective, it may be something that's very a fundamental belief to them that they're taking on board, and you can see their belief in the essay. But then when they look at the other side of the arguments, which are culturally situated maybe, and if they can deal with those sensitively, that is a good essay. And then getting to the end of that essay and saying, actually, again, where we were before, I felt this, I still feel this, however, now I can see.
Yeah, they've opened their minds to it. And I was just going to say, as a head teacher, and teaching writing at primary and developing a curriculum for writing, there are so many strategies out there that recommend a formulaic approach. And then you end up with 30 essays that are more or less identical. And I rejected that wholly because for me, it's exactly what you've just said. I want to see, when I read an essay, I want to see the child in there. I want to hear that student's voice. I want to hear that author's voice. I want to hear in the writing their viewpoint and their style and a bit of their personality. And I think to do that, to promote a formula, I think that has a place. And I think in an exam hall, it's ideal because you've got to just knock them out, you've got a time limit. But I think when you're in a situation, when you're doing dissertation or whatever, it has to be It has to be you. It has to have heart, because that's the whole point. The whole point is that you are researching that at a level that is going to influence the body of thought. It's going to influence information. At PhD level, you have to have you in there, because what you're coming up with is something completely original that's going to contribute to that body of knowledge.
So Liz was saying, and you get to PhD, and yet in that, and that's where you need that voice. And yet at that point, coming back to what we were talking about, you won't have the word I at all, but you will have an opinion and you will have a voice.
And you've inserted your personality into it. Yeah. So if you're in primary school, if you're in high school or lower secondary, upper secondary, we don't always, as a student, we don't get to write about the books that we love or the periods of history that we love. So how do you create that enthusiasm to write a really good essay where they can put a bit of their personality and their arguments into it when they perhaps aren't writing about something that they do have a passion for?
I think that's hard. I think for any student coming to that, it's hard. And I think as a teacher, I think you've got to, before they can write about things that they don't enjoy, they've got to write about things that they do enjoy, because they've got to learn how to do it. And the best way to do that is in a context that they can relate to, or that they have a connection with, whether that is the headphones or whatever that may be. And I think the thing is, once a child has got that thirst for knowledge, that moment where they think, oh my God, if I read about this, I can get this, and this. You've got them then, they'll be able to write about anything. But I think it's about giving them opportunities to enjoy it first. You've got to enjoy it first, because if you don't enjoy it, all you're going to be doing is churning out essays for the examiner or for the marker. That's all you're doing, and you're never going to get to a point where you really want to do it. And that's as a teacher, that's really what you're aiming for, really.
Yeah, I'd agree. And it's also, once you get past that, about them, what we were saying earlier, about them understanding what these skills can do for them in the real world. I mean, how often do you hear, why do I need to learn about this particular element of maths? I'm never going to use it. Why am I having to write about this sonnet? I'm never going to have to do this again. But if they understand those kind of things, like Liz was talking about, the letter to the politician, or when they're doing their covering letter for an interview, a job they might want to go to, or when they're doing their personal statement for university, all of those kind of things where they're learning to write, all those kind of things where those skills are going to come through. I think if they understand the why, I find anybody that understands why they're doing something and what the value of that skill is to them in the real world, because at the end of the day, we're teaching people skills for life. We're not just teaching them to jump through a hoop to get through an exam. So anyone that understands why is much more likely to be interested and get on board with it than they are if they just think they're writing it to pass an exam at the end of the day. Although those exams are important, because obviously they're gateways to other things, they're gateways to when you might actually get to the point where you can make your own question up and look at your own thing. But yeah, understanding why you're doing something, I think, is paramount.
Okay, so thinking of wrapping up, has anybody got any final tips or maybe common sort of pitfalls that students fall into that you want to talk about for the last, I'm not going to time it, but we'll see how it goes. Adrian, do you want to kick us off?
Okay, I've got a micro tip and a macro tip. A micro tip about what's going on in the exercise book, and a macro tip about how to put together kind of sequence of learning. The micro tip is what I used to do with my students is in their exercise books, they used to have a left margin ruled already. I used to get them sometimes to pop a right margin down. You can see the margin from the previous page, so just mirror that. Then you've got margin either side, and you can use that for annotating. So having agreed what our success criteria were, what I get them to do was periodically pause. Okay, you've done a chunk of writing. You show me what you've done in that section of text by annotating it for yourself. And not only does that give the students the opportunity to reflect for themselves on what they've written and work out, okay, what do I still need to do? I found a very welcome outcome for me was that it's dramatically cut down the amount of time I spent marking children's books, whilst dramatically increasing the impact of the feedback that I was giving them. Okay, that's the micro tip. Macro tip: how do we structure a sequence of learning about how to put together a good essay, how to understand different perspectives? We start off by taking them apart. Analyze the points of view in detail. What conclusions do they make? What reasonings and arguments do they make for those claims? Having taken them apart, put them together again. And that's not the same as like just individual sources. Look at a range of different sources from the same perspective and attempt some synthesis on one side of the argument, on another. Throughout this process, provide regular opportunities for the students to reflect. What has been the impact on what I've just learned from my personal perspective? Do that at the beginning, do that at various points throughout. And then you're in a position to address that issue as a whole in detail and communicate what you think about it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Claire, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I suppose the only kind of tip I would have is that once you've written your essay and you've got to the end, make sure that you're in your conclusion that you're answering the question that you've given yourself. Whether we all know that when we're given a question, we teach in the classroom, underline the keywords to make sure you understand what the question means. When you get to the level where you're actually writing your own question, you've also got to answer that question. How many times I've seen that students don't actually, they feel like, I think when they write their own question for something, that it functions as a title rather than something to be answered. And so then off they'll go and write whatever they want because that's their title, not their question to answer. And then sometimes you get to the conclusion and there's lots of stuff in the conclusion that they haven't even touched on in the essay, which if they've been taught via what Adrian has just talked about in terms of looking at the different perspectives and reflecting on them throughout, that's not going to happen. But that's one of the key pitfalls I saw regularly as an examiner.
I can imagine that's quite frustrating.
It just makes you feel sad, actually. It's not frustrating. How many times you see students that have so much to give and should be passing, and they're not, and it just makes you feel sad.
Well, thank you. And finally, Liz, any final tips?
I think my top tip for any teacher is if you want your students to improve, you need to understand the difference between marking and feedback. And that actually a student is far more likely to make progress if they've been through the process that Adrian was talking about earlier: peer marking, peer assessment, looking at each other's work, evaluating their own work. Students get a huge amount from that, comparing their work against others. But as a teacher, not just providing those opportunities, but recognising yourself. That feedback is really important. Constructive feedback, meaningful feedback that a student can respond to, and that actually you will expect to see a response to in the next essay that they turn in. You want to have that ongoing dialogue with your student, and it may only be around one point. It may be that you spend time working on an introduction or certain language that they're using, but if you're giving feedback, you want to have a discussion with your student around what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then expect to see a response to that in the next piece of work that they give you, because that needs to be a cycle. It needs to be that you're feeding back, they're responding to it, and then you see evidence of that in the next assignment that they turn in, because otherwise, as a teacher, what you're saying, it's either going to fall on deaf ears, or they're not going to understand what they need to do with the marking, in inverted commas. So there needs to be an expectation as a teacher that your students are going to respond to the feedback that you give them.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you to Liz, Claire, and Aid for being fantastic guests. If people want to find out more about you, where can they do that? So, Liz, would you like to tell people? Or
yeah, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, so look me up on LinkedIn. Liz Keeble, Chief Operating Officer at the Karalius Foundation.
Thank you very much. And Claire?
Yes, I'm also on LinkedIn. Just Clair Rawlingson. Look me up. That's where you find me.
Perfect. And Aid?
I'm Adrian. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. There's another Adrian Ravenscroft in Birmingham who works at the university.
More than
That's
one.
not me. I don't work at the university.
That's dangerous.
So yeah, yeah. My picture is I'm sat on some outsized books by a lake. That's me.
That sounds very peaceful. Well, all these links will be in the show notes as well. So if you're listening, check out the show notes. That's all we've got time for today. Don't forget to tell your friends about us and rate the show on whatever platform you're listening on, because that really helps us out and gets us in front of more teachers. Our show notes have lots of useful links, like I've mentioned. Remember to follow us on Twitter. That's @CUP Education, and use the hashtag BrighterPod to get in touch. So thank you for listening, and goodbye.